thank you very much for this invitation to this social justice seminar that SNA Toronto is hosting. Very humbly, I have no doubt that I would learn a lot more from each one of you than I can contribute to the pursuit of social justice. But I hope that our different experiences are united by a shared belief and a shared optimism that we will attain a society where there is more equity, diversity, and inclusion. I shall speak here of one attempt to have such impact that is funded by the federal government through its desire for academic research and the pursuit of knowledge in universities and colleges to be transformed through equity, diversity, inclusion, which I'll refer to as EDI. Just to get a little bit of a sense of this audience, are some of you directly affiliated with York University or not so many? York University affiliation of some sort? All right, so I'm glad that I didn't desperately look to find some information about York University as to whether it has signed on to the charter of principles from this program. I didn't have time to find the answer, but maybe it doesn't matter so much to you. Let me make sure that I go. What is dimensions? What does it have to do with social justice? As I just alluded to, this is a program that has been instituted by the federal government. The three funding agencies, the granting councils that fund research in post-secondary institutions, universities, and colleges in all three major domains of health sciences, through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, CIHR, through the Natural Sciences Engineering Research Council, NSERC, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, SSHRC. All three of these are linked to a significant undertaking related to equity, diversity, inclusion. The mandate has come very directly from Minister Duncan and also supported by Minister Baines through ISED. And along with that, Minister of Health, Jane Philpott, and also now, or most recently, Minister Petitpas-Taylor. So important to recognize that in this instance, it is investment in research that is being used to try and bring about an important social transformation. I'll just speak very briefly of a little bit of the policy context before I move on to matters of equity, diversity, inclusion, and research, the initiatives that the federal granting councils have undertaken, and then to speak specifically to the program that we've called Dimensions. In many ways, watershed moment for this is a federal budget that was presented in 2018. On the one hand, there's a chapter that actually spends a lot of time speaking of gender equity. And so feminists were quite happy in 2018 to see all of the support that will be provided to various programs for gender equity. But a different chapter spoke to investment in research, and so the scientists were also quite happy. But that is to say that the efforts that are being undertaken through research funding to reach the post-secondary sector of universities and colleges is not an isolated effort on the part of the federal government. It is part of a larger social vision of equity, diversity, inclusion. Some of the specific initiatives were essentially tied to additional investments for research with conditions. And one of these was to enhance diversity amongst the community of researchers, to also support early career researchers, et cetera, et cetera. So specific efforts, the program I'll talk about was formerly known by its British or UK name of Athena Swan, and we've transformed it to such an extent that we've rebranded it, renamed it Dimensions. There were also support grants to institutions to try and facilitate this type of change. Those two programs are parallel, but they're not directly related in that you can participate in one of the programs and receive some funding, or you can participate in the Dimensions program without funding. And also, one of the very prestigious funding opportunities for scholars in Canada is through the Canada Research Chairs program, and that receive additional funding. So again, that early career researchers who are reaching those recognitions of excellence were going to receive additional funding, and also to make sure that that program would call for greater representation of underrepresented groups and those that have been traditionally disadvantaged in academia. And we've seen those targeted actions actually start bringing some changes. So 2018 is the beginning of this new effort. It built on initiatives that were already underway in the 3 different research councils. At NSERC, for a long time it had been recognized that women were underrepresented in the natural sciences and engineering sectors. And so building on some of those legacy efforts and initiatives, it is NSERC that took on the lead for this EDI initiative on behalf of all 3 research councils. So quickly moving on to, when we look at how research has played out and how the research community looks in Canada, it looks a little more limited than the whole of population. And there's a recognition that if we want to achieve excellence, it has to be much more open, much broader, much more inclusive. So it is very much in a framing of research excellence that we're undertaking these efforts of equity, diversity, inclusion. We state that it is through multiple perspectives and sources of expertise and of knowledge that we can attain greater research excellence, not just from the perspective of different disciplines, but truly from the lived experiences of the researchers and their contribution, their worldviews, their attitudes, values, beliefs that can inform research excellence. We also recognize that these perspectives often intersect, but they also sort of are additive or juxtapose, and that some individuals actually bring about many perspectives, and that is to be sought after. So the changes that need to happen to the research culture and throughout the whole research ecosystem is that, in fact, we first and foremost have to recognize the barriers that have been erected and that need to be taken down. So we have to have much greater reflection as to what has been going on in post-secondary institutions, where we tend to believe that it is generally a favorable environment to those who are in the shared pursuit of knowledge and truth. Well, in fact, it turns out that when you dig a little deeper, start pulling up some numbers, the picture isn't quite as perfect as we would have wished or want to believe. By embedding equity, diversity, inclusion principles in the very design of research, so making sure that the design of research, the methodologies, are calling for many perspectives, perspectives of many different ones, that can bring about greater impact. So here are the numbers from the 2016 census, except for the proportion that speaks to Canadians who self-identify as having a disability. That particular number comes from a separate survey conducted in 2017. And the number that was revealed in 2017, this 22% of Canadians that identify with having a disability, was higher in that targeted study than it was in the 2016 survey, which really reminds us that at different times, under different circumstances, not everyone wishes to self-identify and perhaps take the risk of simply augmenting their otherness rather than a sense of belonging. So otherwise, across the Canadian population, women, just a little bit more than 50%. Persons with disabilities, as I say here, from a 2017 study, above 22%. Indigenous peoples, just under 5%. And members of visible or minorities or racialized groups, about 22%. I'm showing here now the leading programs of the 3 research councils that I've referred to. And you'll see that the proportions do not resemble the fabric of Canadian society. Looking to social sciences, humanities, SSHRC. Regarding women, actually close enough. Looking though across to visible minorities, again, that number's a little lower, so there's a gap. Onto persons with disabilities, significant gap. And Indigenous, in some of the programs, the number is so low that it isn't disclosed. In natural sciences and engineering, NSERC, as I've said, historically, we've understood there was a gap for women. Seems like the environment has attracted more visible minorities. But persons with disabilities, Indigenous, are not the fabric of this research community. Onto health sciences, and Canadian Institute of Health Research, again, you see significant gaps across the board. So each of these different research communities are having to grapple with the question as to why are they not more representative of the Canadian population. And it's not the same story across each of these different research communities. So there is something in the way that we've perpetuated our research cultures within these different disciplinary aspects, that are either more welcoming, perhaps, where barriers are lesser, and we have to understand much better, in fact, what are the differences, and how can we bring about greater equality across. We've been studying this question of women in science a little longer, and we understand it perhaps a little better. And the truth is that persistently, over time, even though there are reasonable representation of women early on in this academic trajectory, the number just keeps decreasing along advancements along the career path. And so from a point where there are in fact a little more women that undertake undergraduate studies than there are men, up at the top of the faculty, established careers, and full professorship, incredible divergence. So we've been talking about a leaky pipeline and trying to understand why is it that across stages of life in a young adult, it becomes less and less inviting, less and less supportive to be part of this research community. So the barriers are embedded in this research culture, and we have to start understanding them. We have to start identifying them, understanding them, and then hopefully bring about the changes so that these barriers are removed. We talk about unconscious and implicit bias. We see it, for instance, in the way that reference letters are written. And remarkably, you would think, oh, male professor who's writing on behalf of a male candidate will use certain terminology and perhaps different terminology speaking of a female candidate or woman. But as it turns out, those women who write letters of reference fall into the same pattern. They speak differently of the male candidate than they would of the female candidate. So it's not even a reflection of their personal sort of perspective that is reflected in the letter of reference. It is the mold of how we consider male candidates as opposed to female candidates. So that understanding of unconscious bias is being exposed more and more and recognized, and by being spoken of, we're trying to overcome it. We understand also that the notion of research excellence has been perpetuated by some who have been successful, the old white male. And if we look at other scholars who may not be perpetuating the same research methodologies, pursuing the same research questions, then they don't fall into the same recognition of research excellence. So we need, in fact, to broaden our understanding of how to bring greater, how to pursue knowledge, how to bring about greater understanding through perhaps much broader range of perspective, research questions, research methodologies, rethinking the notion of research excellence. As sort of alluded to, there's an understanding of a research career that is linear, where productivity continuously increases with time. Well, for many individuals with families, and more often women, that trajectory is not linear. There'll be bursts of activities, there'll be periods when they are inactive, they'll return, they'll have to re-accelerate their research careers, on and on with different patterns that are not linear. Recognizing that, accepting that, and not penalizing for those who do not have a linear trajectory of increased productivity is something that we're more and more paying attention to. There is concern that the research environment, the post-secondary institutions, are not as welcoming to all, that there are not only competitive, but even in times hostile environments. That needs to be called out. We recognize that for many, there aren't role models, and that the few now who reach the summit are very much called upon to serve on many different committees, to mentor and whatnot. And we're recognizing that there's a equity tax, that on them we place a greater burden to bring about changes, which takes them away from pursuing research excellence. So there's some paradoxes that we have to recognize again and try to mitigate. Fewer role models, and as I just mentioned, some of the work that those researchers undertake isn't recognized as part of their research contributions, yet is fundamentally important to the transformation we're seeking. If you're not scholars, it may not matter to you that this survey is taking place. But Statistics Canada has, for 2 months, opened up this survey because, in fact, there's a lot of information that we're missing, a lot of gaps. And we're calling on faculty and post-secondary researchers to provide some more information, self-identifying, but also speaking of their experiences with discrimination, bias, sexual violence, sexual harassment, and on with what might be happening in post-secondary institutions. So we hope to soon have a better understanding of that full picture. So these are the realities that the 3 research councils are coming to grasp with and are trying to address. We've established a fairly ambitious action plan, terminology of the day with our government. You look around and there are many different action plans. Our Edi Action Plan has essentially 3 components. Ensuring that there is equitable access to funding opportunities is to look fundamentally at how we call for researchers to submit their applications, how we undertake the whole review process of those applications, those committees of peer experts who are convened to make these adjudication. Each and every step of the way, there is a risk of adding or erecting barriers, or more likely of implicit bias. And so taking measures to address each step of the way and make sure that every element is made to be representative of a diverse community, to be inclusive of many perspectives, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the key initiatives then is to truly embed principles of EDI. And for those of you who may be more familiar with work that the government undertakes, there's also an approach to assessing different policies, programs, services that is known as Gender-Based Analysis Plus, GBA Plus. The plus is for the many perspective other than gender to consider a policy, a program, et cetera, et cetera. So we're embedding those considerations in the work we do, in the policies we develop, programs that we deliver, et cetera, et cetera. As I mentioned, committees. Who sits on a committee, who doesn't sit on a committee, and why is it that so many of the committees have a certain type of reviewer and not more diversity? More and more, we're looking to diversify the makeup of our committees, of peer reviewers, but also our advisory committees, our governance committees. And I spoke to the notion of research excellence already. Equitable and inclusive participation in the research system. So we're also turning the spotlight on the institutions themselves and trying to support their efforts in ensuring greater equity, diversity, inclusion. The program dimensions fits under this element of our action plan, as does institutional grants that I referred to, and more looking at what means do the institutions take to ensure that there's greater equity, diversity, inclusion. The data piece, as I said, lots of gaps of understanding and knowledge, and by collecting the data, quantitative data through surveys, but otherwise qualitative, analytical understanding, we're hoping that we can better inform the changes that are needed. What are we trying to achieve? Participation that is representative of the Canadian population, and success rates that is proportional to those who are participating in our programs. On that note, there's generally some optimism that, for instance, at NSERC, if there is a lower rate of women who apply to our grants, they nevertheless seem to succeed sort of equal to their participation. That was not the case with an important change that the Canadian Institutes of Health Research had recently brought about to their programs. They'd reconfigured all of their funding through two main streams. Project streams were a little bit more confined, specific to a research project over a shorter period of time, and a stream of foundation funding, which was meant to establish a greater base of investment for a larger program of research. But the focus there was mostly on the researcher. And they very quickly recognized that the success rates were not at all the same between men and women who had applied for that funding stream. And they've actually removed that funding stream so that they did not want to perpetuate that disparity between success rates between men and women who were applying to CHR. We are calling for EDI in the very makeup of research teams. And more there is that emphasis on not just a lone researcher with a lone graduate student supporting the work, but much funding goes to larger teams and making sure that those teams take on the responsibility of, if not themselves attaining sort of diverse makeup, nevertheless making sure that those opportunities to understand the perspective of others, ability to teach about EDI, that those principles of training are now more and more embedded in how teams approach the research that is funded. The indicators of research excellence, I need not say more. Membership, I need not say more. And recognition of the efforts of institutions that are making progress on the EDI. And this is where the Dimensions program really comes about. So just a year ago, fall of 2018, subsequent to a very specific mention in the federal budget of the Athena Swan program from the UK, we embarked on consultations across Canada to talk about the Made in Canada Athena Swan. First round of consultations, large urban centers, 5 big cities, but then on to winter, and then we went across some 17 or 15 different localities hosted by different institutions of different size to really collect all of the hopes, expectations, all of the challenges that institutions face when they want to advance and improve on matters of equity, diversity, inclusion. Our program, as I said, was based on what has been done in the UK, very quickly followed by Ireland. That program, though, has been adapted in the US, known as Sea Change, and in Australia, known as SAGE. However, in each of those instances, the focus has remained on the STEM discipline of science, technology, engineering, maths, perhaps medicine. Canada has been much more ambitious, and I'll come to that. But it is to say that as much as I was talking in the Canadian context, that in 2018 the federal government was making, on the one hand, part of the federal budget, much initiatives and support for gender equity, as much as in the science realm, research realm, there is this greater international recognition amongst research funders that those disparities are persistent and need addressing. Dimensions, I hope you appreciate the sort of logo that we have, the sort of many windows within one, many cubes within one, to really capture that essence of multiple dimensions to the program, the multiple lived experiences of individuals. We often use the term of intersectionality, but here is a logo that tries to capture the many visions, the many angles, the many perspectives that will contribute to research excellence. So, broader scope than the other international models. We are including all post-secondary institutions. This is not just for universities, but also for colleges. And the colleges, well, there are many more of them across Canada, and they're very closely connected with their communities, whether in urban centers, but also in more rural or remote areas where you'll find colleges and no university. So our hope is that we really do spread this effort broadly across Canada. The lever that the government is using, its ability to fund research through post-secondary institutions, it could have limited it to the universities, and that would have been still fairly broad, but going on to colleges really broadens the scope of this initiative beyond what has been done in other countries, recognizing the uniqueness of Canadian colleges. Other programs have focused foremost on women. Some have moved on in the US, as well, first in the UK. There was a gender charter of principles, then came a race charter. In the US, they very quickly took on not just concerns regarding women, but racialized groups. In Australia, a concern for their Indigenous peoples. But in Canada, there are 5 underrepresented or disadvantaged groups that we're trying to address. Women, people with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, people from visible minorities or racialized groups, as well as the LGBTQ2+ community. And those individuals, we haven't even typically tried to survey, and we don't really even know their experiences in an environment which, again, we might think as being progressive and open and welcoming to those individuals, but we in fact don't know the reality of their experience. So very ambitious in that these different groups are facing very different type of barriers. They're facing very different manners of discrimination. They experience bias very differently. Some of them identify it as equity-seeking groups. Our indigenous peoples often speak of rights-seeking, being a rights-seeking group. So there will be competing interest, and the challenge of the Dimensions program is to actually unify our efforts towards something where the participation is as broad and as universal as it can be. Across all disciplines. So as I mentioned, in terms of the health research community and sort of rate of participation in funding opportunities, in terms of the natural sciences, engineering, in terms of social sciences and humanities, we've mentioned earlier, there are differences. And so the approach cannot just be one approach. This is based on disciplinary cultures, epistemologies, methodologies, and there is a lot of work across the 3 agencies to even understand themselves so that we can better understand our respective research communities. I've called this uniquely ambitious, and I think the Canadian program could very much lead internationally. So we're excited to be receiving attention from our colleagues in New Zealand, and also hoping that we'll be in more conversations with other European countries. So the Dimensions program is based on a charter of principles of equity, diversity, inclusion. I thank the organizers for placing a copy of this charter in everyone's program. And we have, at this point, about 100 institutions that have endorsed the charter. And this is just a sign of goodwill. There are no direct consequences, no direct obligations that stem from endorsing this charter. But hopefully this is a public commitment that some institutions have made. The majority of those are universities. The colleges are, as much as I hope will take part, still feel a little less involved generally with the research councils, so there's much work to be there. And then a few other organizations involved in the research ecosystem have also pledged to this charter. It has 8 principles, and without going through all of them, since you have the text, wide-ranging in that easily you could remove the word research and see that it pertains to all activities of universities. However, in Canada, we have certain jurisdictions, and we want to step on the toes of our provincial governments. The federal government has that authority or that ability to fund research, and that is, as I've said, the lever we're using. This is a pilot, or at least we're at that early stage of trying to design a Made in Canada program. To help us do this, rather than the agencies making assumptions, making findings on their own from where they are sitting in Ottawa, we're calling upon a group of institutions that we've selected, 17 of them, to form the core cohort that will inform the process itself. In other countries, which have also proceeded with a pilot stage before launching an open program. They were usually inviting institutions and presenting to them a handbook, an application, and seeking information afterwards. We are starting from no handbook, no application. Through our consultations, we'd heard the expectations that the program would reflect Canadian realities, would be flexible as to the different the different circumstances regionally, the different circumstances for large, middle-sized, small institutions and colleges, on and on as to the uniqueness of the Canadian program. So these 17 institutions intended to reflect those many different perspectives are working with us, and we're speaking of a true co-development effort. Those 17 will be the first one to be able to ultimately fill out an application form, which they will have helped design, and could be the first to be recognized for their efforts through an award or recognition of sorts. The expectation is that they establish self-assessment teams within the institution, that they undertake reflection on their own policies and practices, that they perhaps look at the data that they collect regarding the makeup of the faculty, regarding the makeup of administrative staff, perhaps even students, those involved in research primarily, and understanding what gaps there are, what measures they have to take, establishing those action plans again, and over time being able to demonstrate the progress they make to remove barriers and fill those gaps. So at this point, we've started a series of workshops online through the web, convening our 17 institutions, presenting the outline of the program, asking them to introduce themselves to each other so that we can facilitate the sharing. We have amongst the institutions in this program quite a few that already are leading the sector, the post-secondary sector. In Toronto, Ryerson is recognized for many of its EDI efforts. But we've also selected some universities or colleges which are only starting. They've shown the goodwill, and they demonstrated that they would be apt or fit for purpose informing us through the pilot. So the co-development, again, speaking to the desire that the program ultimately be flexible, reflecting Canadian realities, and that it build on what is already going on. The various perspectives from various institutions, and the terms of participation whereby what we present to them, what we develop with them, they will respond to and help us build upon a manual of instructions, a manual of promising practices, of what has been perhaps tested already as working, is effective, the best practices, perhaps those that haven't yet been fully vetted, the promising practices. So just bring that all to a cohort to be discussed, to be, and then to be described as ways to proceed. Our timeline here indicated a very busy 2018-2019, that series of consultations, launching the charter, the document itself, inviting institutions to participate in the pilot, and now we'll be working with them over a period of 2 years or so until they submit their applications, which would be reviewed and lead to recognition or award, and then evaluating whether this program has been successful and should be opened and continued or sustained over time. So one participant in consultation workshop saw dimensions as an opportunity to rethink, reformulate, and re-inspire. I've also gone back to my political science roots, and a political philosopher, Canadian political philosopher, Will Kimlicka, although speaking not at all about universities or the post-secondary institutions, but truly of nations, says we need to acknowledge and respect diversity, but we also need to continue to care about each other and make sacrifices for each other. And we're calling upon all of those in the research community, post-secondary sector, to be inspired by such words. There are some resources you'd find online if you wanted to learn more. We would welcome other comments or questions. If you have colleagues that are closely involved, please pass on the contact information. But otherwise, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for the invitation, and we'll welcome a bit of a discussion.